helps you. Okay, so often the world was referred to as a clockwork universe. The thought was that all the planets and everything are so meticulously coordinated. You know, we can predict eclipses and things like that. The planets move in regular orbits. It's like even, you know, the whole universe is like a giant machine, as Hume puts it here. Remember, he's writing this in the 1700s. And subdivided in an infinite number of smaller machines. What do you think he might be talking about when he talks about an infinite number of smaller machines?
To me, I always interpret that as the infinite number would be like a lot of things, and then the smaller machines will be every function, every operation that our body does, that plants does. It's just like,
yeah,
and of course it's all one big
right.
thing, but it's all in smaller pieces.
Yeah.
Just like how our human body system is. Just how
Yeah.
our oxygen is coming in from our nose to our lungs, and then our lungs to our heart, and then goes to our body. And then back to our
Right, that there are lots of different functions and lots of different organs. And we saw that Paley does this. Remember? Paley says, look, what made the watch unique, what made it different from the stone, is that it had a large number of parts that were coordinated to work together to enable it to serve a purpose, a function. You know, the wheels and gears and springs in an old tick-tock watch all work together to enable the hands to move so it can be used for telling time, as an instrument for telling time. And so Paley then extends that analogy by saying, well, look at parts of animals and plants in nature. Remember, Paley said, look at the human eye. He says, isn't that like the watch in a lot of respects, in that it has a lot of moving parts, or parts that are put together to enable it to serve the purpose, you know, conveying information to the brain and enabling us to see. So the design argument is almost always portrayed as an argument from analogy. In an argument from analogy, you say, well, okay, here are two things, A and B. They are alike in certain respects. Here, Paley says the watch is like an organ like the eye, and so the smaller machines, you're exactly correct, that Hume's talking about here are the various parts of animals and plants that. So he says, okay, watch has a lot of small parts that work together to serve a purpose. So does an organ like the human eye. So those are your premises. You say, you know what? These two things have these features in common. And the argument says, so probably, it's only a probabilistic argument at best, probably they share some other important feature in common if they're already similar. And of course, the idea is the watch didn't just get there in the field by the brute forces of nature, but the watch needed an intelligent designer to design it so all those little gears and springs work together the way they're supposed to. And so then you extend it and say, well, okay, if a man-made object like a watch needed a designer, what about the other things in nature that also have intricate parts that work together to serve a purpose? Didn't they need a designer also? And of course, who would the designer of things in nature be but God? So the idea is Cleanthes, remember, he's the intellectual believer in Hume's dialogues. summarizes the argument here, and I thought I'd summarize it again. So the smaller machines are like the parts, and all machines and their parts are admirably and accurately adjusted to one another, right? The parts are coordinated together to allow them to do what? Well, means the way the parts are put together, these are adapted to ends, the various purposes the organs serve, in ways that resemble yet exceed the products of human design, like Paley's watch. Right? Now remember, Paley writes after Hume. His book comes out in 1802. Hume died in 1776. Wish us luck in our revolution. And, so Hume's writing a bit before Paley. So the analogy, the effects, the products of design resemble each other. A watch resembles something like the eye. By analogy, then, the causes, the designers, must resemble each other. And also Hume asks, what about the universe as a whole? Because that's what we're claiming is designed. And so from the design argument, you could get the conclusion that the author of nature, that is God, would be like human beings in that God is an intelligence capable of designing the world, except that God has larger faculties, that is, God has a much greater intelligence, since the products of divine design, like the brain, the eye, the ear, are grander than the simple products of human design, like a watch. Or Hume doesn't talk about a watch, he talks about human design objects like ships or like houses. So the conclusion then is that God exists and has an intelligence similar to human intelligence, but much better. Now, Damien, remember, is a sort of fundamentalist believer here. He doesn't like the design argument because it's based on experience, it's a posteriori. He would like to see something that's mathematically airtight, like the argument we looked at last week, like the ontological argument. So he observes that at best, since it relies on an observed similarity of God to man and of the creation to man-made products, as such, it's only a probable argument, and that's true. Even at best, the design argument can only show that it's more probable than not that there was a designer, if it works, okay? Damien would rather see an airtight mathematical argument like the ontological argument. But, so we're going to pass over his observation, but Philo, remember Philo, you can see, Philo, philosopher. Philo, as we said, is the character in Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion that represents the skeptical philosopher. In other words, Philo is voicing Hume's own position, right? And Philo doesn't object to the design argument because it's only probable. He says, wait a second, there are other arguments, probabilistic arguments, that are very strong. I was watching a show about prospectors in a friend's house. They had cable, and here are these guys digging out west for gems, for precious stones, and the one spot they were trying to dig in, there was this big rock above them, and they were afraid throughout the show that the thing might come rolling down on them. Right? We know what'll happen if a rock comes loose. We know that it'll roll down the hill because we've seen that happen many times before. Right? So that a stone will fall we've had many cases where we've experienced that ourselves, or we have seen that a fire will burn, or take a book or a box of matches, right? You know what you expect the first match to do when you strike it, because you've seen what happens with other matches that are just like it. And you expect the second match to do the same thing, right? So here you're comparing things that are exactly similar, or that the Earth has solidity. So these are based on many thousands of observations, and he says the exact similarity of the cases assures us of a similar event. But here's where Hume is going with this. He's going to try to say that when we compare the universe as a whole to to a manufactured object like a house or a ship, that we're comparing apples and oranges, the way we would say it colloquially today, right? That we're not comparing two things that are very similar. So Hume says, my quibble with the design argument is not that it's an argument from analogy, because he says there are good arguments from analogy that are based on very similar cases and comparing two very similar things. But he says my quibble with it, or one of my quibbles, is that it's not a very strong analogy, he says. There's a joke that I heard in college, right, about a final exam that contained only two questions, right? Question one was describe the universe, and question two was provide two examples. Well, part of the reason that is a joke, besides the fact that it's a tall order to describe the universe in 2 hours of an exam period, is that we don't have two examples. And this is what Hume points out. Now, I realize physicists today and some logicians talk about parallel universes. You may have seen that come up when you were reading on the fine-tuning argument. But back in Hume's day, people weren't talking about the existence of parallel universes. There was only one universe. So Hume says, look, it's not like we've seen the stone roll down the hill many times, we can predict what it'll do, or we've seen the same kind of match laid over and over again. He says we've only got one supposed example of design, our present universe, and so that's all we have to go from. But also, he says, the design argument may be only a weak analogy because it's not comparing similar things. And here Hume tries to educate his readers. He knows that he's writing this book to some people who may not know technically what an argument from analogy is supposed to do, and what separates out a good argument from analogy from a bad argument from analogy. So he tries to educate his readers on this. And his point here is that the more alike the things you're comparing, the stronger is your argument from analogy. When the things you're comparing are not as similar, then your argument is much weaker and may even be a bad argument. So he uses the example of circulation, right? Circulation of the blood. He says if you're comparing apples with apples, if you're comparing how blood circulates in one human body to another human body, he says it's beyond doubt that you can conclude that the circulation of blood in other human beings is just like it is in your case, from the observation of circulation in a human being. But he says even if we weaken the analogy, and I don't know if some students recently have told me they still do this in some biology classes where they dissect a live frog, and you can, they anesthetize. You open it up and you see the little heart beating, right? I mean, even simple animals like frogs and fishes have blood that circulates through them. Okay? So he says it's only a presumption, but a strong one, to conclude that human blood circulation is like the way it circulates in other animals, like a frog. Okay? And it does circulate in the frog. As I said, if you open a live frog up, which I don't even know if they're allowed to do that kind of an experiment anymore, but I saw it done in biology class. You can actually see the heart. But Hume says, what if we took two things that are very dissimilar? Now, I was up in Connecticut playing backgammon over the weekend, and one of my disappointments was I thought, man, I'm going up to Connecticut. The leaves ought to be in full peak colors up there. And they weren't at all. I mean, the temperatures were in the upper 70s there. They've been almost as warm up there as we've been here. But we know that it's that time of year, right? I learned in biology class that sap does not circulate in a tree, right? In this time of the year, it goes back down into the roots, along with, chlorophyll that is turning the leaves green, leaving only the xanthophyll and carotene, which is what is responsible for the yellow and orange colors, respectively. See, I was awake in biology class on that day. And in other words, the sap, there are similarities, because the sap in a vegetable, if you ever cut a corn stalk or something, you look in it and they're little tubules, right? So here's a liquid, right? Sap is like blood, it's a liquid, right? Some similarities there. It moves in a plant in little tubules. But he says it would be wrong to conclude from some superficial similarities that sap in plants circulates constantly like blood in animals. So you see his point here. It's not just that an argument from analogy comparing dissimilar things may not be a very strong argument, but it may actually lead us to a false conclusion. And what would be a false conclusion for Hume? Well, Hume is probably an atheist. He's certainly at least a very skeptical agnostic. The difference is an atheist says positively there is no God, atheoi. Whereas an agnostic comes from the Greek meaning I do not know, is someone who says, well, maybe there's a God, maybe there isn't, but I don't know. And I'm not going to commit myself to saying there is one. Well, Hume is at least a strong agnostic, if not an atheist. So, the underlying lesson here is that if we're comparing the similar things in the design argument, we may end up concluding that there's a God who isn't there, right? That's where Hume's really going with this. So, I have a house that, if you looked on the paperwork, says the home was built in 1900. You might say, well, that's kind of interesting that it was built exactly in that year. How does that happen? Well, I'll tell you how that happens. How that happens is nobody knows what year my house was built in, because the records of homes from the 1800s like mine, old Baltimore homes, and the same with the ones that are around here, right? Were all burned up in the Great Baltimore Fire of, I don't know, something like 1904 or 1905. It was a huge fire. A lot of records, public records, were destroyed. And that wasn't the computer era, right? If the only existing record is in this or that file cabinet and the building burns down and everything in it gets burned up, there's no record of it. Especially a lot of the file cabinets back then were wooden. So they just arbitrarily picked 1900 as the date. But even though I don't know when the home was built, I don't know who built it. My family bought the house in 1955, right? I mean, it isn't like there's a family history and we know that our past relatives built it. But even from that, I don't have any problem with the conclusion that my home did not spontaneously spring up on that lot, that it needed a designer and builder, just like every other home I've seen needed a designer and builder, right? Because you're comparing two exactly similar things. So Hume says on seeing a house, we conclude with the greatest certainty that it had to have had a builder. Like mine needed a builder, even though the records were lost. Because houses we've observed in the past have had to have builders, so this house we're looking at must have. Similar effects, similar causes, you're comparing similar things. But Hume says what ultimately the design argument asks us to do is buy into the claim that the whole universe was designed by an intelligent designer. And he says, well, how like is it to compare a machine or a man-made object like a house to the universe as a whole? And Hume doesn't think that you're comparing very similar things, apples and oranges, the way we'd say. So he says the universe as a whole doesn't seem to be like a house. And so the presumption that a designer is needed, that is a presumption of a similar cause to that of a house, namely an intelligence that designs and builds it, is only a guess, a conjecture, a presumption. And he says the design argument is not a very good analogy. So that's his conclusion there. But now he makes a point that contemporary evolutionists would chime in on. Now remember, Charles Darwin writes in the 1840s. Hume dies in 1776, right? So he's, maybe 70 years or so, 60 or 70 years before Darwin, right? And he's not a scientist, but he does speculate. As an educated person of his day, he knows something about, the science that would have been around in the 1700s in England. And so he speculates. He says, look, even if we observe order in this world, he says design is only one possible cause of that order. Philo and Cleanthes both agree that the following would only be proof of design if it were shown by experience to proceed from it. Order, arrangement, adjustment of parts to final causes. So he says we need to have actually observed that these things needed an intelligence, an external intelligence like God for the things in nature. he says, but a priori, apart from any experience, and we don't have any experience of the design of the universe, the above, that is, the order in the world, the fact that the things have an arrangement of parts that seem to enable them to support a purpose, could be caused, he says, by some force internal to matter itself, some natural force, not an external intelligence. And anybody ever buy rock candy at like an old general store like Cracker Barrel? Anybody know what old rock candy was? I mean, it's just what every mother would like to give her child, right? I mean, they actually sold it in candy stores, right? Basically, rock candy is, it's not just that it contains a lot of sugar, it is sugar. It's sugar in crystallized form. How do you make it? Well, you remember from basic chemistry that if you heat up a liquid, you can dissolve a lot more of some chemical in it, right? So the way you make it at home, I had a chemistry set book that actually described this, is you heat up water. This is a good rainy day project, though you might not want your child to be eating it, but you at least make it. You heat up water and you dissolve a bunch of just plain white sugar, like Domino sugar, that's the local sugar company, in it. And then what you do is you put a stick or a ruler or something and you suspend a string into the liquid. And then, of course, the water cools and all that dissolved sugar crystallizes out around the string and forms crystals that look like they're the product of manufacture and design, and yet those elegant crystals are come about as a result of just the natural forces of nature, just like quartz crystals do. So that's a speculation. He says matter may cause its own order as well as order being caused by a designer. Now, of course, you can always say, well, that only pushes the argument back, because the question is, well, why is nature such that crystals form? One interesting thing here is ice. For most things, the solid form of something is much more condensed and heavier than even a liquid form. Ice is an exception. The solid form of water, because of its crystalline structure, is actually lighter than water. Now, what's the significance of that? Consider, say, a pond with ice forming on it. Suppose ice were heavier than water. Well, if it were heavier than water, once it got formed to a given thickness, it would just, boom, go down to the bottom of the pond and take every living thing with it, right? But why is it that ice has a different kind of crystalline structure? Anyway, I mean, that's a point that creationists would point to. But so Hume says, look, the elements may fall into some exquisite arrangement, like our quartz crystals or like our rock candy crystals, by some unknown internal material cause. You see what he's saying here? He says, even if we observe order, direct design is only one possible cause of order, that there might just be natural forces that tend toward order in nature. Now note the similarity to local claims of Darwinism. And this would be the Darwinian story about something like the eye, wouldn't it? Darwinianism, I mean, evolution as a natural process was conceived by Darwin originally to not aim at any goal, let alone the goal of producing us, to be an entirely random process. But how do you get more complex organisms? Well, organisms adapt to their environment. Some adapt better than others, some members of a species, and they develop what are called advantageous variations. And one of those might be a better eye than other members of their species. And then in the evolutionary struggle for survival, those members of the species with advantageous variations are selected for survival, and other members are selected by natural selection for extinction. And this is an entirely random natural process. But the story of evolution as a natural process is, over millions of years, with advantageous mutations developing regularly, you get animals with more and more complex eyes, until finally you get the complex eye that we have, by an entirely natural process. So the order and the arrangement of parts for them is entirely natural. Now this is an aside. I read a book when I was in high school called Human Destiny, written by a scientist, and I still think there's something to the argument he presented there. My problem personally with evolution as an entirely naturalistic process is not when you're talking about complex animals that have developed enough complexity so that they can reproduce and adapt to their environment. My problem with evolution as an entirely natural process comes much further back when you're talking about how do you get even one strand of DNA by just randomness. You know, he showed statistically that it would take billions of years to even get one strand of DNA. And you say, well, hasn't the Earth been around for billions of years? Yes. But again, you know, I think the odds are so against it developing naturally that. But at any rate, this is Hume. Okay, so this does not finish Hume, but he speculates, and we only have a minute or two, about other possible natural causes of order besides design. And I took the other class through a few of these slides quickly, so it's worth going. We have about 3 minutes. I can get through. So you see, Hume is familiar with the science of his day. He can talk about forces like heat and cold, which is what made our sugar crystals, or magnetism, other forces. So he says design is only one of them. Some things in nature affect others by design, but it's illegitimate to reason that all do, that everything's a product of design. Now, Cleanthes makes the Paley's point, and Hume doesn't answer it significantly. Cleanthes says, aren't there millions of examples of design like the eye? And the question is, are we really comparing things that are that dissimilar when we compare something like the eye to a design product like the watch? So he says the the most obvious conclusion, Cleanthes says, who's a believer, is that there's a divine designer, and the abstruse arguments of skeptics like Hume are far less obvious. That's his reply. But Hume never does a good job of answering Paley's basic thing. Okay, so change. So his other point then is, even if we observe order, there are other causes of order than design. And I gave you in very brief evolution's story here. In other words, it's easy to tell that story once you've got animals capable that are complex enough to adapt to their environment. But my problem comes way sooner than that. How do you even get enough DNA to make one animal from entirely naturalistic means? But let's go on. He says Hume doesn't think the argument's a good argument because it asks us to conclude from a finite, very imperfect world. I'm going to have to finish this up next time because it's 11:50. A perfect maker, which he doesn't think is a good thing. So somebody remind me. I'm going to have to look at this. I left off at this slide. We'll finish up with this and go to the next item on the syllabus, which I think is the problem of evil.
You have to touch this.